Hi, Frank. Thank you for sharing this very interesting article. In this video, I'm going to give you my quick take on this. So I'll get right to it. So, Frank, I think this is more of a statistical test rather than a scientific article, let's say. And here, the goal is to find, using statistics, the efficacy of adding, and I'm having a hard time pronouncing these medications, cabozantinib in combination with nivolumab and ipilimumab. And I'm just going to refer to them as capital C, capital N, capital I. And we're going to do this with patients with previously untreated advanced renal cell carcinoma. And I think that these three drugs come from three different classes. And INN were originally approved to treat melanoma, and now INN are used in combination to treat other types of cancer, I guess including renal cell. The affected population are patients with advanced clear cell renal cell carcinoma who haven't previously received treatment and have intermediate or poor prognostic risk. So I guess this is a typical double-blind trial, and I guess blind is because the review board doesn't know if they're in the control or experimental. And patients are randomly assigned the experimental, where the C drug is added with N and I, and the control group where you use a placebo in addition with the N and the I. And the primary endpoint is progression-free survival, as determined by a blind independent review. The article claims that the sample size is above 800, but I think for the first endpoint, they only use 550 patients. I'm not going to discuss the secondary endpoint. I think that it deals with side effects. So in the introduction of the article, after 12 months, 57% of the experimental group continues to survive, and 49% in the control group continues to survive. And then they talk about this hazard ratio. And the hazard ratio for disease progression or death is 73%. And the 95% confidence interval for this hazard ratio is 57% to 94%. Now, an aside here, the 94% almost kisses 1. The reason that 1 is important because if there's no variation and the hazard ratio is 1 for everybody, then it means there's no difference between the control and the experimental group. But just as another remark, this is still a large confidence interval. So what it basically is saying is that not everybody's going to respond the same way to this treatment. So the question is what is this hazard ratio and what is it telling us? How do they calculate it, and what are the basic assumptions? And finally, is it a good measure of efficacy? So to look at this, you look at this technique called survival analysis or hazard rate analysis with the Kaplan-Meier method. Now, as an aside, this is used in economics for, particularly for labor measures. So one might ask the question is how long can an employment spell last before one goes into a spell of unemployment? And so the random variable again is time. How long does one stay in a certain state until the event occurs? Sometimes the event is a good event, sometimes a bad event. In terms of employment, the good event is staying employed and the bad event is becoming unemployed. Here, in this analysis with this chart, it's staying in this state of progression-free survival. So you look at this chart and you see that the y-axis goes from 0 to 1, and it's labeled probability of progression-free survival. I think probability of probability. I think that might be a mistype or something like that. But anyway, everybody, the control of the experimental, everybody starts off at 1. Okay, everybody is surviving. And then the orange-yellow line is the experimental group, and the blue line is the control group. And the reason that the line falls is because either people die or they go into they get out of the progression-free survival. So the event is losing this progression-free survival. So what the experimental line shows is that on average, more people are the time length to stay in progression-free survival is longer than it is in the control group. I mean, there are deaths in both groups, but the experimental group, it seems to be slowed down. So, how do you use this chart, or how do you use the data in this chart to get the hazard ratio? Well, the first thing that one has to do is fit a Cox or a Cox regression to both the experimental line and the control line. And it will be a regression of the probability of progression-free survival. And it has the form of the anti-log to the minus lambda t. And what you're doing is you're finding the lambda parameter that best fits the line. And you're going to have a different lambda for the experimental and a different line for the control group. And the experimental lambda will have a subscript of E, and the control lambda will have a subscript of C. Now, if you look at this function, the antilog of negative lambda to t, you'll see that it's bounded. When t equals 0, it has to equal 1. And when t equals infinity, it's got to equal 0. In other words, everybody dies eventually. And in this case, the lambda E is going to be less than lambda C. So the hazard ratio is just the lambda E divided by the lambda C. And in this case, it's 0.73%. And this is this is done by statistical fitting, by regression analysis. But, sometimes the context must be explained. So here is the same Kaplan-Meier, but it's for isoclavir, which I guess is used to treat herpes. And in this case, the experimental deals with those that get the isoclavir, and the controls get the placebo. Now, here the event is losing pain, and that's a good event. And so you'll see here, unlike the previous chart, the control line is below the experimental line is below the control line. And here the hazard rate, instead of being below 1, is above 1, and that's what you want. And what it means here is that if you take this isoclavir versus the placebo, on average, you leave the pain state, the rash pain, I guess, sooner than you would by just taking the placebo. But notice again that even with the placebo, that the pain mitigates in both cases. It's just that it happens on average faster with the drug. So, the basics, how we get this lambda. And the lambda, again, remember, it's the ratio of the two lambdas that's going to give you the hazard ratio. And so, with the survival model, the probability that an event doesn't occur at time t, given that it hasn't occurred cumulative from time 0 to time t, is this anti-log to the lambda t. Also, the probability that the event will occur is just 1 minus that probability, so it's 1 minus the anti-log to lambda t. And so the instantaneous probability that an event occurs at time t is this lambda. That's why it's so important. That's why it's the key ingredient to this hazard ratio. And to see this, the fraction of the people that have survived this is anti-log to the lambda t, and it's just 1 minus anti-log to the lambda t. And all you do is you just take the derivative of the probability that the event will change with respect to time over the probability that you stay in that event, and you'll see you finally get lambda. Now, the assumptions of this model are that the lambda is path independent. The probability of an event is independent of t. So whether you're at month 6, month 12, month 20, the instantaneous probability of an event is always going to be lambda. Is that a realistic assumption? Well, it's up to the eye of the beholder. And finally, this is a class of the Markov model. So, in summary, I guess it's safe to say that this C drug is an improvement over just the I and the N. I understand reading the article that there are increased side effects. So, is it enough? I mean, at 12 months, going from 57 to 49, if the side effects are higher or if it's extremely expensive, maybe it might not be a good idea. But Frank, it's still a very interesting article. It provides food for thought, and I enjoyed reading it. And again, thank you so much.